Leaders say they are looking for a just and lasting peace in the Russia-Ukraine war with their mouths, but while their actions seem to be saying they're preparing for a war with Russia. If they don't change their policies and make a few other changes here, they may eventually get their way. There is right now a large and growing gulf between the Western ways of thinking, whether it's in Europe or the United States, and there's elements in both places, but there are two very divergent views of what reality is and what the philosophy is that we should even pursue. What does peace even mean right now? And these differences are not academic, they're not minor. If they are not resolved, or if one side wins this argument ultimately, and that turns into actions and policies that result in things changing on the ground, we may one day find ourselves inexorably, like a vortex, drawn into a war that should never have been fought, that can't be won, and will be absolutely devastating for everybody who gets involved in it. The stakes are enormous. And if you think I'm exaggerating, stick around to the end of this show, because I've got something to show you that is just jaw-dropping that came out of France just yesterday. But we're going to start actually today with the European Union President Ursula von der Leyen meeting with Zelensky, reinforcing that they're going to continue supporting Ukraine militarily.
This is a watershed moment for Europe. And Ukraine, as part of our European family, it's also a watershed moment for Ukraine. Europe faces a clear and present danger, and therefore Europe has to be able to protect itself, to defend itself, as we have to put Ukraine in a position to protect itself and to push for a lasting and just peace. We want a peace through strength. And this is the reason why I present today to the leaders the Rearm Europe plan. The Rearm Europe plan provides up to 800 billion euros for defense investment. It gives the member states possibility to invest in the Ukrainian defense industry or to procure military capabilities that go right away to Ukraine. So it is to the benefit of rearming Europe, rearming the European Union, but also arming Ukraine in its existential fight for its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
What is she talking about? I mean, just look at this from the surface of it here. This war has been going on for over 3 years now. We're now rolling into the 4th year. President Trump has made unequivocal and repeatedly that this war is coming to an end, and he wants it to come to an end quickly. Just looking on the ground, the war has everything the European Union has tried, everything the Biden administration before this has tried, was an absolute, utter, abject failure, diplomatically and militarily. And now she's saying here today, we want to put Ukraine in a position to where it can have so-called peace through strength. And then what they're saying is, just strip this down to its bare bones here. So you see what this genuinely is, what she's saying. This is an arms buildup. This is a prelude to war. They're saying they want an $800 billion defense increase or war fund that they're trying to get here so that they can defend themselves, so that they view that they're getting ready for a war. And there's only one opponent that this even can be, and that is Russia. So they seem to be saying our focus and our mentality right now is not to accept anything that happened before this, anything that happened during all these 3+ years of war, or anything that happened before that. We're going to ignore it all, and we're not going to acknowledge anything went wrong. We're not going to acknowledge any mistakes made. Instead, we're going to double and apparently times 8 down and keep spending more money on military stuff, because this great Russian monolith is coming to get us all, so they say. Well, what is the Russian side saying? I mean, because there must be some really bellicose statements coming out of Russia that they're coming to get the European Union. Well, not so much, because here is what their chief diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, said. I think this was also today.
Speaking of these unreasonable accusations of Russia that we are preparing for war against Europe and France, President Putin has said many times that this is absolute nonsense. And I think that any reasonable person would understand that Russia doesn't want any war. Russia wants to eliminate the root causes of the situation created by the West in Ukraine, in order to suppress the influence and essentially to wage war against Russia.
So look, he said Russia is interested in ending the war. We're looking to find the root causes and to resolve them. Russia has said over and over, it wants to get back to having a normal European security architecture where everyone is safe. That's what the Russians are saying. Those words never come out of anyone in Europe, anyone in the West, other than President Trump. He's the only one who's saying this. And of course, he's being ridiculed by many quarters in both Europe and in the United States for giving into a so-called tyrant or whatever, all these different accusations that they make. But you see, anyone who talks peace, anyone who talks ending the war is assailed by this groupthink in the West that says the only way we can achieve peace, this lasting and just peace. That phrase she used, I pointed out in yesterday's show, that keeps going over and over and over, coming out of so many Western lips. But the definition is always Russia is quelled or put into a box, and Europe and Ukraine in particular is raised up so that it can defend itself, so that it can, eventually win back its territories. Various people define it in different ways, but that's always the bottom line: peace through strength. So they want to change the battle dynamics on the ground until they can get to a position they perceive in their minds that somehow is theoretically possible, that one day they'll get to a position that will, quote, make Russia realize it can't win. And then they'll end up making some kind of concessions to an end that's actually beneficial to the Ukraine side. And that actually is not just my analysis or supposition. It's actually said by the chief diplomat of the European Union, Kaja Kallas.
I hope that we reach a political agreement on the support for Ukraine, because we really need to make them stronger so that they are able to end this war on their terms, and therefore they need the European support for this.
So that was Secretary of War Kaja Kallas. Oh, I'm sorry. I mean the chief diplomat. You can understand my confusion. This is someone who never talks diplomacy, who only talks we need to increase the strength of the Ukraine side so that they can get a peace on their favor. Listen, gracious, it's hard for me to keep having to say this over and over, but on what planet are all of these people living? I get it. You want this outcome. You don't want this outcome. But doesn't a rational person at some point, however much they may want something, have to come to the conclusion and the recognition of just what exists? This is the equivalent of standing on the roof of your house and saying, you know what? I'd like to walk over to the roof of the adjacent house here. So I'm just going to stand on my roof and just walk across the air and then get on the other house because I want to. And I know that there's this thing called the law of gravity, but I'm really kind of elevated above that. And we've moved beyond this. And that may have affected people in the rear in the past, but today, because I want to, I'm just going to walk across thin air until I get there. And you can do that up to a point. Once you step off the edge, though, reality will impose itself on you, and you're going to have a crash. And so far, even though the laws of physics are well known, we seem to still be moving toward the edge of that roof, thinking we're going to walk across into thin air and not fall. And it just boggles the mind. If anyone who's read any history of warfare, much less looked at it over, I don't know, the last 1,000 years or so of human conflict, of looking just the last few centuries of conflict, just the last 1 century of conflict, I don't know, look for a single war. It just doesn't work that way. When all of the things that have happened to the Ukraine side, the profound number of casualties they've had, and then just the obvious balance of power between the two in every category that matters is all and irrevocably on the Russian side. Why then would you want to set an objective that can't be met, and that if you pursue it hard enough and put $800 billion towards trying to achieve the impossible, what do you think is going to happen on the other side of this equation? Because everything's an equation. Nothing is done in isolation. If you start saying you're going to have an $800 billion defensive fund, and you're going to start building up, and you want to have Ukraine increasing strength, what do you think the Russians are going to do? Are they going to say, oh, fiddlesticks, I didn't realize that they were that serious about it. All right, fellas, let's get our toys and our weapons and our bombs and stuff and just go home. Cool, I got it. I mean, I think that in some Western fantasies, they actually think that. But let me tell you what will happen. I can say with great confidence, Russia will do the opposite. They will likewise start a buildup. We've seen this play out just 1 century ago, folks. It was called a Cold War, and it put us at one point in 1962 on the verge of mutual destruction with the October 1962. We could have actually had just really blown the whole world up. We were that close to nuclear war. That's what a nuclear buildup. That's what, when you get two different sides building up like this, two powerful sides, you raise the chance of that happening. And it's just so disappointing to me to see so many ostensibly intelligent people ignore those realities, walk closer to the edge of that roof, and still think, no, I can walk on this one. I can walk on the air, and the law of gravity won't apply to me. Really, even though the thousands of years of human history before then, and the nature of conflict and the nature of man in their conflict, that may have applied in the past, but it doesn't apply to me. And because I don't want it to apply to Russia, it won't. They'll back down, even though everything that they have done over the last 3 years, all in cumulative total, is succeeding. And there's no reason to think it's going to happen. It's going to continue on any other ways, especially if Europe keeps going down this path. But that's not all. So it's not just the European Union per se. It's also the individual states. And then here you have Emmanuel Macron, who, again, sounds more like he's looking for war than looking for peace.
It must be said clearly, we are entering a new era. The war in Ukraine has now lasted for more than 3 years. From day one, we decided to support Ukraine and sanction Russia. And we were right to do so, because it is not only the Ukrainian people who are fighting courageously for their freedom, it is also our security that is at stake. Indeed, if a country can invade its neighbor in Europe with impunity, then no one can be sure of anything anymore. The law of the strongest would prevail, and peace could no longer be guaranteed on our continent, as history has taught us. Beyond Ukraine, the Russian threat is present. It affects European countries, and it affects us. Russia has already turned the Ukrainian conflict into a global one. It has mobilized North Korean soldiers and Iranian equipment while helping these countries arm themselves further.
Yeah, so if you just listen to that one clip, you would think, man, wow, I guess he's got some good points there, because Russia's taking this thing global. They're adding all these people, that all the stuff that they're doing, out of nowhere, they threaten us. And if we don't stop them here in Ukraine, they're going to continue rolling all the way to, I don't know, the English Channel. They'll go all the way to Paris. We'll have a replay of World War II. But that is just ridiculous on the surface of it. And it highlights one of the big errors and just conceptual failures of this level of thinking, this line of thinking in the West. Everything happens is for nothing we ever done. None of our actions ever have consequences. It's all the Russians, those darn evil Russians. Remember, Russia bad, Ukraine good. Putin evil, Zelensky is the good guy. That's all you need to know. Everything else fits into that nice, neat little box. It's not true, but that's what they want you to believe. And if you use that construct, that mentality, then anything they say fits nicely into it. There's no reason for Russia to do this except there is some reason, because humans, forget about nationalities, forget about anything else, right and wrong, anything else, just human interaction. Actions have consequences, whether you want them to or not. They do. And that applies to everybody equally on all sides here. But for him to point out, that was last night, I think, that, yes, see, as his latest evidence, Russia is taking this international. So in 2024, they added North Korean troops, and they, of course, had been getting help from Iran before that. And so now he's saying, look, that's what these darn evil Russians are doing, except he might want to look in the rearview mirror on the Western side. Here's a clip from somebody of some importance in April of 2022.
Thank you all for rallying so quickly for this historic meeting of the Ukraine Defense Consultative Group. It is an extraordinary gathering with more than 40 countries represented here today, and we're here to help Ukraine win the fight against Russia's unjust invasion.
Oh, wait. We took it international first. Immediately. That was 2 months into the war. And here now we're bragging, and we did throughout this whole period of time, bragged about how we have, I think it later turned out to be 50 nations. That's what we claimed anyway. 50 nations all around the world gathered together to try and put Russia in its place. Didn't work out that way. But now here you have Macron saying all those evil Russians, they have 2 other countries. We have 50. But you see, there is a consequence. What did Russia do when they saw that this alliance was against them? You know, so many times people want to say, oh, this little Ukraine here, they got all of these people together and they stood up to this big behemoth all this time. It's part of the I guess schizophrenia in the West. On the one hand, we say Russia's nothing, man. They can't even beat the Ukraine side, you know, this small little country against the big one. Then at the same time, like Macron just did there, same time, they'll say, but they're going to roll to France. They're going to roll to the English Channel, even though they're saying the exact opposite things at the same time. But this country, when they see all of these people allied against them, then what are they going to do? They ramp up their production. They seek allies of their own, and they push back. And when their troops are being killed in combat because of the alliance that's arrayed against them, proudly so, they're going to do the same thing back. So if you want to have the argument now, which Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Macron are, that peace through strength, we'll show those darn Russians that if we just get strong enough, they'll back down. When every piece of physical evidence that you have provided shows the exact opposite happening. They have gotten bigger, stronger, more capable, and if you show them so-called strength, all you're doing is convincing them that you're going to attack and eventually destroy them. And so, like any person on the planet, any country on the planet, any people group, if you threaten them, they will do whatever they can within their capacity to push back on that threat. So just like we saw in the Cold War, tit for tat, you do one thing, they'll do the opposite. We're not talking about a Taliban situation here. We're not talking about some Islamic radical group that's insurgent fighters that you can just carry on and do whatever you want, and there's literally nothing they can do in response. Obviously, that's not the case here. I say obviously, but maybe it's not obvious because these people are acting like they're talking about the Taliban over here. Although, I guess, to be fair, even if they were using that analogy, that's a bad one too, because the Taliban, even though we put all this money and billions of dollars in 20 years of time with NATO, it was a complete and utter failure, an outright strategic defeat. The Taliban were there on October 2001. The Taliban is there today. All the stuff that we did, all the money we spent, all the troops we lost, all the policies that we had, all these grand statements that we made came to nada. We want to now pigeonhole that and memory hole that, put it out of the way. And we wanted to go on now on something profoundly bigger, talking the same way we did before, but with a nuclear power. I mean, what kind of insanity is that? Now, for his benefit, the Trump administration, look, once some people can find flaws, whatever they want, or holes in things, or things to complain about, like any administration that exists, but especially in this issue right here, they deserve some credit for being willing to say something that's different than this prevailing groupthink. And here is Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying, hey, fellas, y'all got to have more than just bumper stickers. You got to have some kind of strategy.
It's been very clear from the beginning that President Trump views this as a protracted, stalemated conflict. And frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine and Russia. And it needs to come to an end. And no one has any idea or any plan to bring it to an end. The plan of the Ukrainians up to now and their allies on Capitol Hill and the people you talk to in other countries is, let's just keep giving them as much as they need for as long as it takes. That's not a strategy.
It's not a strategy. And that's really important, because even in those statements that I just showed you sound bites of previously, there's no objective listed. They're not saying, all right, we're going to apply this much resources. We're going to have this tactical objective. We're going to have this strategic objective. This is what the end state. Here's what we want to accomplish. Here's the resources we think that it will reasonably take to get there. And then we're going to apply these policies to try and bring it into fruition. They don't have that. All they do is talk about, I want an $800 billion defense fund. Who's going to benefit from that, I wonder. And we want to just bring peace to strength, bumper stickers. You didn't hear anywhere in there, and I didn't hear it when listening to these statements in their full, or things that I've read about, or anywhere else for that matter. I've never heard them say what I just did there. This is the objective we want to accomplish. It will literally, and I mean, it will look like this. The Russians will be stopped. The Ukrainians will have defensive perimeters. Both sides will recognize there's no need for war, and then everything will get back to some kind of peaceful coexistence. That is an objective. Whether I would agree with it or not is a separate issue. But you first of all have to have that. And then in their own minds, whatever objective they have painted, then they have to show a rational path to get from where we are right now to the successful accomplishment of that. And they have to be able to say, it will probably cost X billion dollars, maybe 800 billion. It's going to take this many men. It's going to take this much production of X, Y, and Z, this much political capital, this much diplomatic capital, this much economic capabilities, etc. And then we think that this can get us here. There is no plan like that. There is just Russia bad, Ukraine good, 800 billion bucks on the table here. No conception for how this can actually be translated into reality. Because, and here's the biggest fly in the ointment. You have to provide on the Western side, if this is the objective you want, you have to provide some kind of rationale for why Russia would ever agree to this. You have to be able to say, all right, Russia has these views and these things that it's important to them. I get that. But we want to present them a sequence of events and a collection of objectives that they can live with so that they can say, okay, I get it. I don't like it. I'll hold my nose, but we can live with that as long as it ends up being, now that we're not threatened by you either. No conception of that at all. No attempt to do that. I mean, hell, until Trump got office, they wouldn't even talk to Russia. Ergo, they don't really know what Russia thinks. That is more important than you can imagine. If you cannot rationally come up with any kind of scenario where the other side can live with your preferred outcome, you virtually guarantee continual conflict. And it can be a Cold War conflict, and it can be a hot war conflict. And now one guy who's all for this and could care less about any strategies is the veritable Volodymyr Zelensky, who also today said this.
During all this period and last week, you stay with us, and of course from all the Ukrainians, from all our nations, big appreciation. We are very thankful that we are not alone, and these are not just words, we feel it. It's very important. You made a strong signal to Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian warriors, to civilians, to all our families, and it's great that we are not alone. We feel it, and we know it.
Yeah, I mean, he's really great with that. Yeah, he said he's been nothing but, ever since he left the White House last Friday, it's been nothing but warmth and pats on the back and applause out in front of 10 Downing Street, a meeting with the king, now here with all these European folks, and they're all saying this great stuff. Hang on, though. Something isn't quite right about this. He just sent a letter, I think it was the day before, to the President of the United States, who read it in a national televised broadcast.
Earlier today, I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership.
Yeah, I didn't hear him say anything in that speech today about wanting to put himself under the strong leadership of President Trump and his plan to end the war. I heard him say a lot about thanking Europe for their warm welcome and $800 billion promise. You saw him standing right next to Ursula von der Leyen when she's talking about that. Those things are mutually exclusive. You're either working towards a negotiated settlement to end this and bring to about a condition of peace, or you're moving down the European side, which is to move towards more confrontation with Russia to try and militarily build up the Ukraine side. Those things are mutually exclusive. They cannot both exist. One precludes the other. You go down this path, there will be no peace. You get on this path, there will be no military buildup. So which is it, Zelensky? Which one are you pursuing? And of course, I think the answer is self-evident, both. And he's just trying to placate Trump. He's trying to woo and get all the stuff that he can from the European side. That's what he's trying. And he is not doing what I have suggested, which is the rational thing to do, which is to say, what are the possibilities here? What are the inputs necessary? What are the resources available? What is the objective? He has no objective other than not to give away the game here, not to stop. And many in the West are applauding that. They say that's exactly what he should do. In fact, this really starts to expose the gulf in the understanding about where we are here. And the gulf between the two sides aren't really equal. You have really President Trump and his senior team in this one, I won't even say corner, in this one little place right here. And then you still have this huge prevailing attitude throughout what appears to be the majority of Europe, not all, thankfully, but the majority of Europe, as demonstrated by these comments we see here. And I don't know if it's just the Democratic Party in the United States, but certainly a significant majority of it is there, or in the liberal thinking here, and in the establishment thinking. And in fact, Fiona Hill, you may know, is a figure of some importance, has been on the scene for a long time as a Russia expert. She was interviewed yesterday, and she's going to try and lay the foundation for supporting Europe. But this is really odd because up till nearly the end of the clip I'm about to show you, it sounds like she's backing Trump and saying, wow, what he's doing is good. Watch how this goes.
President Trump's view of Russia is very much shaped by the 1980s. I mean, he's very much in that framework of thinking about the Soviet Union as the great superpower and as the big nuclear threat. I mean, I've personally heard him talk about that the greatest threat to the world and to the United States is nuclear weapons. And he would like to finish off, this is his kind of view, the unfinished business that Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan and other US presidents basically started off in the 1980s. So the year that I went to the Soviet Union when you were at St. Andrews, 1987, 1988, was the Gorbachev-Reagan summit. It was the signing of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that ended the nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I'm just saying all of this because this kind of Trump's mindset is that he wants to go back to that period. And so no matter what we're thinking about what's happening at the moment, his view that he wants to sit down directly with Putin and just kind of pick up where everybody left off in the 1980s. Now the problem is a lot's happened ever since then.
What? Wait a minute. You're ridiculing him for wanting to go to Russia to sit down with the other nuclear superpower and to try to find ways like Gorbachev and Reagan did, where they radically lowered the tensions down and effectively brought the Cold War to an end, lessening the possibility of anything going sideways, ending in a nuclear conflict. And you're saying something's wrong with that? I mean, that's spectacular. I just can't even understand how you would not, at the end of your own statement there, say, actually, that sounds like a pretty good deal. That's what we should be doing. That's what diplomacy is. Look, I know a lot of people have issues with President Trump in whatever area here, but holy cow, he is the only guy on the planet right now in any power. Viktor Orban and Robert Fico are exceptions in Europe, but unfortunately their level of power and influence is minor in Europe, and they haven't gotten a lot of followers behind them, but they're certainly with Trump on this one. But he's the one and the only one in the United States with any power who's willing to say, hey, forget about this stuff. He is actually looking at the ground. He's doing many of the things that I've argued that the previous administration should have done, which just do a calculation, just see what is and isn't possible on the ground. What sense does it make to go down a path that can't succeed militarily, diplomatically, financially, or economically, any other category you want to use? Why put political and physical capital trying to achieve something that can't be done when the net result is going to be to make the other side stronger than they have been. And that was the signal failure of the Biden administration. They attempted to make Russia weak. They have instead produced something profoundly stronger than they were in February of 2022. Why would I want to fuel the Russia's rise when instead I could say, hey, how about we get this killing off the table here, and we end the possibility this war could expand and definitely lower the chance of any kind of nuclear exchange, which would be catastrophic for the entire world, most acutely for the Western world. That's the only thing that makes any sense at all. It's so obvious that it should be, that's the situation everyone should be pursuing. The European Union, all of their diplomats, all of their leaders should be saying, how can we end this war and end the risk that anybody else gets caught up in this? Instead, they're saying, I know none of this stuff has worked, but we're going to keep going down this path here. And one of the big reasons that enables them to do that is their blindness to anything that happened yesterday or 15 years before that, for example. Now, I believe it was April of 2022, I wrote a piece for the publication 1945, and I said, hey, this war didn't come out of nowhere. This thing was 15 years in the making. And in that article, I wrote that it is of paramount importance, even in the midst of Russian tanks bearing down on Kiev, that we acknowledge where the missed opportunities we had to prevent war were, because if we maintain the same blind spots that blocked us from preventing the outbreak of war, we may unwittingly lay the foundation for something much worse, an escalation of the hostilities that could expand beyond the Ukraine border and, in a catastrophic worst case, end in nuclear attack. That's what I wrote in 2022. We haven't learned anything as a Western thought process overall, because we're still going down that path right now. And, you know, on that point there, I said 15 years in the making. One of the things I specifically pointed out there was that 15-year mark started in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. That's the one we just finished up here. Well, at that predecessor, that was, if I'm not mistaken, the first time that Russian President Vladimir Putin was invited there, because it'd been the Cold War had been over, whatever. And now then Russia was kind of starting to take a step back up and trying to have European integration. And they said, all right, we're going to invite you to this for the first time. In this, he says, listen, about NATO expansion, he wanted to lay some foundations here, that he wanted peace. And this whole thing, and this, it's a very long speech, where he said he did want good relations with the West. He did want to improve relations and have peaceful coexistence and a security architecture in all of Europe that benefited everybody. But he gave this warning.
Тоже происходит в это же самое время. А в это самое время в Болгарии и Румынии появляются так называемые легкие американские передовые базы по 5000 штыков в каждой. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. А мы, строго выполняя договор, никак не реагируем на эти действия. Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса или к обеспечению безопасности в Европе. Наоборот, это серьезно провоцирующий фактор, снижающий уровень взаимного доверия. И у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение. И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора? Где теперь эти заявления? О них даже никто не помнит. Но я позволю себе напомнить в этой аудитории. Хотел бы привести цитату из выступления генерального секретаря НАТО господина Вернера в Брюсселе 17 мая 1990 года. Он тогда сказал: сам факт, что мы готовы не размещать войска НАТО за пределами территории ФРГ, дает Советскому Союзу твердые гарантии безопасности. Где эти гарантии?
Now, listen, there's so many in the West want to say that actually the West never gave any security guarantees. They never guaranteed they weren't going to move 1 inch to the east, etc. And here's Putin actually quoting the Secretary General Mark Verna at the time. And he says that. And people say, oh, that's not, he took it out of context. It's not what he's saying. Yeah, except that he's not taking it out of context. This is actually the speech by the Secretary General Manfred Werner at the Rama talks in this is the date here is 2 March 2001. And then you scroll down to his speech. This is, by the way, on the NATO website, not the Russian disinformation, the NATO website. You see that his speech, he said, and I quote, "This will also be true of a united Germany in NATO. The very fact that we are ready not to deploy NATO troops beyond the territory of the Federal Republic gives the Soviet Union firm security guarantees." So that was not just something that was said, that was taken out of context. That was explicitly stated by the NATO. And you saw the result of it there. Putin said, this undermines trust. Now, then you jump forward here to the Minsk agreements in 2015. They had written agreements by the West, which they didn't follow through with. And the key one being that the Ukraine side would change its constitution to recognize limited autonomy for the Russian speakers in the East and would effectively end the civil war that had started the year before that. They never did it. They never did it. Even after Zelensky came in 2019, he still never changed the constitution. And until the constitution was changed, Russia said that they're not going to do their part, which was to withdraw all their military support from the rebel side. So both sides ended up not doing parts of their agreement. But the Russians said, well, it would be foolish for us to pull back our military support when you haven't done the first part yet, because then you haven't gotten the core reasons for the conflict in the beginning. And you see a continuing theme here. The Russians are always focused on resolving the core root of the problem. We don't ever want to deal with the core root of the problem. We just want it to work out our way. And we want Russia to trust us, but we don't give them any reason to trust us. And that end, you see, is the gulf between the side in the Western thinking right now that ignores the reality, that ignores that actions have consequences, and just wants Russia to go away. And so they're willing to ignore all of the power dynamics that exist and continue on with what they want to do. It's even worse than that, though, today. Because here is, this is, I believe it was yesterday on the floor of the French Parliament, in the Senate specifically, when a French Senator, Malamud, yesterday said, listen, here's the great dichotomy here. In this clip that you're about to see, and this is just a small part of a very long speech, which is really extraordinary because it's very, very sharp. It's going to condemn President Trump, but it's also going to condemn any kind of thought besides the one that Ursula von der Leyen, that Kaja Kallas, that Volodymyr Zelensky are promoting, and ignoring anything on the Russian side. Check this out.
Trump a fait plus de mal à l'Amérique qu'en 4 ans de sa dernière présidence. Nous étions en guerre contre un dictateur, nous nous battons désormais contre un dictateur soutenu par un traître. Il y a 8 jours, au moment même où Trump passait la main dans le dos de Macron à la Maison-Blanche, les États-Unis votaient à l'ONU avec la Russie et la Corée du Nord contre les Européens réclamant le départ des troupes russes. 2 jours plus tard, dans le bureau ovale, le planqué du service militaire donnait des leçons de morale et de stratégie au héros de guerre Zelensky avant de le congédier comme un palefrenier en lui ordonnant de se soumettre ou de se démettre. Cette nuit, il a franchi un pas de plus dans l'infamie en stoppant la livraison d'armes pourtant promise. Que faire devant cette trahison? La réponse est simple: faire face. Et d'abord ne pas se tromper. La défaite de l'Ukraine serait la défaite de l'Europe. Les pays baltes, la Géorgie, la Moldavie sont déjà sur la liste. Le but de Poutine est le retour à Yalta où fut cédé la moitié du continent à Staline. Le coup de pouce américain à Poutine est la plus grande erreur stratégique jamais commise lors d'une guerre. Le choc est violent, mais il a une vertu. Les Européens sortent du déni. Ils ont compris en un jour à Munich que la survie de l'Ukraine et l'avenir de l'Europe sont entre leurs mains et qu'ils ont 3 impératifs. Accélérer l'aide militaire à l'Ukraine pour compenser le lâchage américain, pour qu'elle tienne, et bien sûr pour imposer sa présence et celle de l'Europe dans toute négociation. Cela coûtera cher. Il faudra en terminer avec le tabou de l'utilisation des avoirs russes gelés. Il faudra contourner les complices de Moscou à l'intérieur même de l'Europe par une coalition des seuls pays volontaires, avec bien sûr le Royaume-Uni.
Wow, that is so detached from reality. It is tragic. And yet many in Europe hold that view. Many in the United States hold that view. I mean, he said, let's just look at some of the more egregious ones here, because he says this with a lot of conviction. He says it with a great accent. You know, he's got a lot of gravitas. He looks great on the camera. He says, war hero Zelensky. He called him a war hero. Volodymyr Zelensky captured the imagination of the world, and like the first or second day of the war, when he famously said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. I don't want anybody in the West to help me get out of Kiev. I want more ammunition to fight. And that's when he, got the moniker that he's the new Churchill and all this kind of stuff. And he rallied the support of his troops. And so everybody says, yeah, that is fantastic. It was true. He literally thwarted what the Russians wanted to do. What the Russians wanted to do was to have the shock effect of armor rolling into his country from 5 different directions and have him realize that the war couldn't be won, and to capitulate and to go back to the terms which the Russians had offered in December of 2021, which would have been basically the Minsk agreements, but now it wouldn't have included Luhansk and Donetsk. That was what the Russians wanted. They miscalculated, and they were not prepared, and they were not resourced for Zelensky doing what he did. And so from that moment on, everyone in the West said he's a hero. Not so fast. Because Russia was still right. Putin was ultimately right, even in that disaster from the Russian side, how it unfolded there, and the brilliant side from the Ukraine side in those first few months literally turned the tide of everything. Except that it didn't turn the tide. It just slowed it down for a while. The balance of power dynamics were still there. That didn't change anything. And even though Russia and Putin in particular were humiliated and embarrassed by what happened, they had the natural resources, the human capital, they had everything they needed and time to reverse the damage. And that's exactly what they did. They spent it like at least a year and a half going on the defensive, making tactical sacrifices where necessary to preserve their power while building up national combat power in the safety of their vast country, which they succeeded in doing. And so by, quote, being a hero at that time, he, instead of bringing the war to a quick and rapid negotiated settlement, which of course was on the table in April of that just 2 months later, he committed his country to a path of full-scale war, and with no compromises given anywhere, no capitulations on any point, and instead just resolutely said he's going to fight. You call him a war hero. He was an emotional figure at that time that really rallied a lot of people, but his actual conduct as a wartime leader has been profoundly bad. He has gotten so many of his people killed in battles that should never have been fought or should have been ended earlier, and it could have been repositioned to a position of more strength for his side. He jettisoned that every time. And I can just go down the list. Mariupol, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Vuhledar. I mean, the list just keeps going on and on and on. And even this so-called success last year in the Kursk direction, many hailed that and said, yeah, he has, embarrassed Putin again. Well, did he though? Did he really? Whether it was the actual Russian plan or just something they took advantage of, only time will be able to tell. But I can tell you absolutely, certainly, that by continuing to reinforce that incursion and to send people up in there into a region which had no tactical or strategic value to the Russians, it was an embarrassment, but it didn't cause any compromise or all difficulty with the war effort. But what it did do is sucked in tens of thousands of Ukrainian men, many of their best trained guys. They just kept feeding them into that meat grinder. Thousands of combat vehicles literally litter the streets and the roads and the fields in that part of Russia. And now then, in the 7th month, I guess, Russia appears to be putting a little bit more emphasis to finally close that thing off. In the process of doing that, they also, because they sent so many tens of thousands of troops and vehicles there and ammunition and all the support, they didn't have it in the east. And the Russians have continued to make big advances. And in fact, especially when that happened, the advances accelerated for a good period of time. His leadership was terrible. Then there's the issue on the Dnieper River in, I think it was late 2023. No one wants to talk about it anymore. At the time, they were saying, yeah, Ukraine has had this incursion over the Dnieper River in a place called Krinky, and they've got a beachhead knocked out. And Oh, yeah, that turned out to be nothing. It was self-evidently nothing because they didn't have the capacity to exploit it once they had it, and it was obvious from the beginning to everyone except Volodymyr Zelensky. You call him a war hero. He was a horrible wartime leader. He is singularly, well, not singularly, he is primarily responsible for the loss that Ukraine has already suffered. The only thing to be determined now is how far that final loss will be, and for Europe to figure out how much deeper you want to get in the loss so that you also suffer greater loss. One of the other things that he said is that he considered a betrayal of what Trump is doing. Trump is very focused, and he's also very transparent about this. He says, I want the killing to stop. He has been emphatic about that. He sees that this can't be won. One of the very few Western leaders who are willing to acknowledge the reality. He wants this pointless killing to be stopped. By all accounts, over 1 million Ukrainians have been killed already. God only knows how many millions more have been wounded, or the PTSD, the psychological impacts of this will only be uncovered in the decades to come. Already, that's already baked in. You can't undo that. Nothing can. Not even Trump ended this war quickly. You call him, this senator, a betrayal by wanting to keep alive the men in Ukraine who are fighting right now. I think that it's arguable that the betrayal is on senators like this one, is on leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, of like Kaja Kallas, of like Emmanuel Macron, all these people that want to keep the war going, who have no plan for how to end it, who seem completely callous and disregard the lives of the Ukrainian people, who seem to be either blind or ignorant of the failures in 2023 to go on the offense, the failure in 2024 to stop the Russian offensive, the claim that if they got $61 billion from the U.S. in early 2024, that would change the tide, and it didn't. In fact, ironically, the Russian advance accelerated after the Ukraine side got the beginnings of that $61 billion. And you want to ignore everything that happened, and now here we are in March of 2025, where the only person in the Western world that is trying to save the lives of the Ukrainian people, you have people like these French leaders, you like the European leaders, like those in some of the other parts in the eastern part of Ukraine. They want the war to continue on, oblivious or unconcerned that doing so will just increase the number of killing, and it won't change the outcome, folks. It's over. It's been over for a long time. I think the last vestige of any theoretical possibility ended in the end of the summer of 2023, really the beginning of the summer, but by the 2023. And instead of acknowledging that and stopping the killing then, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men have paid the eternal loss of their lives. And there are now literally hundreds of thousands of orphans, children without a father, wives without husband, families without their sons and daughters. It is horrible. It is immoral. It is reprehensible. And until somebody finally recognizes this reality, the killing will continue. I say this, unfortunately, too many times, and every time I've said this, thousands of people have died on the other side of it. But people who are alive in Ukraine right now, as I'm making this video, who are alive today and could be alive if the war would come to an end, will die. There are people who are being grabbed off the streets, terrified in cities all over Ukraine, being forced to the front to die for something that can't be changed. Not dying for patriotic reasons, not dying for their country, dying for the people in Europe who callously want to keep the war going, for a theoretical, hypothetical outcome that will never be accomplished. They're willing to let more men be stolen off the streets and thrown into a cauldron of fire to be killed. In my view, that is the most morally reprehensible thing that could be done. It will be a stain on the Western world for decades to come, because this war will come to an end at some point. And once that's done, then a lot of the hyper emotions stop. Historians are going to start going to work to find out what was really going on behind the scenes all this time. And we're going to find out. I feel very confident we'll find out that a lot of these people knew the war was lost. They knew they couldn't succeed, but because they said, well, it'll keep getting some Russians killed, so that's cool, we'll just keep going with that. Oblivious to the profound and permanent loss of life in the Ukraine side. That will be a stain on our legacy for a long time. And I just hope that President Trump is able to stand firm against all this onslaught of pressure from both the United States and in parts of Europe, because if he is the only thing that can stop this killing. Because listen, Russia's going to get a lot more than they have right now. One way or the other, they'll either get it through negotiations, but the killing will stop, or they will take it on the battlefield. And there's nothing that can stop them. All of this $800 billion is not going to stop them. And what I fear the most is that aside from the damage that's already been done, that the European leaders still won't learn. They'll still keep going on a military buildup, and the Russian side then will say, well, damn, if you guys don't ever want to have peace, if you don't want any kind of living together, then they may say, you're going to get the war that you wanted. Maybe they take the Baltics, because they may say, okay, if I know that that NATO and the European unions are building up for a war with me, then I'm going to seal my entire western border. I'm going to shut the whole thing off. And then they may take the Baltics. And I assure you that if it came down to it, they militarily, conventionally can. There's no doubt about it. I mean, when you look at the actual number of forces that the Baltics have, it's not a pittance. There's no way they could stop it. They think they have the Article 5 guarantees, but then that would put all the rest of the Europe and the United States in a position, are we ready to go to nuclear war with Russia? Yeah, it's a gamble for Russia to take that risk, because scared people, it worries me, scared people who are in a position of conventional inferiority but have nuclear weapons may make bad choices. So it is not a safe bet for Russia, and I really hope they don't do it. But we can't eliminate that possibility. But here's what the Europeans need to understand. You keep going down the path you're going to, not even seeking cooperation and coexistence with Russia, then the only alternative you leave them is the military version on their side. And just human nature being what it is, Putin himself is going to be under a lot of pressure not to keep that corridor open on his flank there. He will have secured the part in Ukraine, but he'll still have that NATO on his border in the northwest. And he'll come under a lot of pressure to shut that off. And so ironic that if the European Union had just come to an acceptance in December 2021 that, okay, we're never going to let them into NATO anyway, that would be dumb. They don't have the criteria. They don't meet it. We don't want to spend any money there. And we dang sure don't want to give an Article 5 to the leader of Ukraine, who's got this volatile relation with the nuclear power Russia. We'll just take that off the table and just, move on and just go about our business. If we had done that, then the energy would still be flowing to the Western Europe. They would still be getting the cheap energy that they have. The inputs for their economic production would come at a lower cost, and they would have a chance to continue growing. Nobody would have died in Ukraine. All of Ukraine, minus Crimea, would have still, even ostensibly, been under the control of Kiev. That's what would have happened if we'd have just done what made sense then. Or if we had done what made sense in October 2022, then those conditions still would generally have applied, except now it would have been two provinces that were now gone to Russia, because they had declared independence before this thing started. But you should see what happens every time you go further. Now then, it wasn't just two. Now then, it's four. And last summer, it was four. And now then, it's almost certainly going to be more than that. I can't even imagine a scenario now where Russia willingly agrees to give the Western Europeans and the Zelensky folks what they want when they have the power to take it all the way to the Dnieper River. If we don't take that deal, then we continue to give Russia motivation to then start looking at the Baltics there to close off any of the last remaining vestiges of threat by NATO to their security. That's where we are, folks. It is that big and that significant. And I want to bring in Gary at this point to talk about some of this. And kind of, Gary, you've pulled a lot of these quotes. There's a bunch we could have pulled in that we didn't have time. But do you see any hope that people will at some point in the West finally realize this is so detached from reality that even we can't keep this up, and we need to go ahead and stop it?
Yeah, I'm not confident that, Danny. They got such a momentum going on their side, at least at the moment. Danny, that was one hell of a presentation. It was a master class on what's not only going on in the on the ground, but then and behind doors, or not even behind doors, in front of the cameras, with it politically what's going on. And it's almost like the European, it's almost like a peace resistance from the Europeans, that at any cost we are going to proceed here. And you heard that they're throwing all their money behind it. Starmer's committed his own peoples behind it, and maybe some others are going to join him. You wonder when the fork in the road that is down this road that Zelensky is on, Trump's not relenting, and the European is only throwing more wood on their fire. There's going to be a fork in the road pretty soon.
Yeah, I want to go there because we showed the soundbite of Waltz. I think it was 2 days ago, or maybe it was even yesterday morning. I can't remember, where he said, "All right, we're going to talk to the Ukraine side. We're going to see if we can find a path to peace." What do you think is going to happen if he doesn't? If Zelensky stays like he was earlier today, of saying, "Yeah, thank you to all this $800 billion, keep it rolling," and Trump is saying, "We're ready to end this." I mean, there's got to be, like you said, you call it a fork in the road. There's got to be a decision point coming up pretty soon, right?
Yeah, you didn't talk about it here, but I know you knew about this, that the Trump allies are holding secret talks with Zelensky's Ukrainian opponents. And this report says that the discussion that they had, these secret talks, the discussion centered on whether Ukraine could hold quick presidential elections. Denny, what's the chance that they kick Zelensky to the side? That's what they're trying to do. What would the time frame be? How quickly could it possibly happen?
Well, I think that if Zelensky doesn't change his tune pretty fast, I think Trump's going to cut bait. I mean, he's shown he did it with Kim Jong-un when he was trying to get a nuclear deal that he himself had started, but when he didn't get a deal he thought he should have gotten, he was willing to even end something like that. This situation where Zelensky humiliated, in Trump's view, humiliated his vice president and then got into an argument with him, and then seems to backtrack when he read this beautiful letter during the State of the Union, a joint session of Congress the other night. And then later that same night, Zelensky's still saying, "I'm not going to give up any territory. I'm not going to have changed my political anything. And we're going to keep going on until we succeed. We're not going to give in anything to the Russians." I mean, those things are just mutually exclusive again. And I can't imagine that Trump's going to be very patient with that.
Danny, I agree. Listen, do you think Trump's going to let this guy yank him around like this, talking out of both sides of his mouth? That's why to see that headline that they're actually having these talks to figure out how to maneuver and how to get this guy out of the way, because he's not even just a fly in the ointment, man. He is just, he is one big problem. And I thought it was interesting how in that clip that we played from Zelensky, that he even mentioned to those the people that he was having that news conference with, he goes, you stuck through me last week. Yeah, he knows what a mistake that was last week, and they had people sticking by him through through the rumble in the White House. So I think I think he knows that he doesn't have a lot of time, which is why he's ramping things up on his side, Zelensky's side, so quickly and as fast as he possibly can, because there isn't a lot of time here.
Yeah, and when you see, man, people keep saying, yeah, that this is what Europe should do, and then this $800 billion, that's a big deal. We're not talking, $61 billion, which we thought was a big deal that the United States gave. Now you're talking $800 billion over some period of time, and the majority of that, like it is with the UK, is to strengthen European, preparing for war. The reports coming out yesterday, we could have shown that headline that Germany is preparing for war with Russia, and you certainly know that those in the Baltics are doing the same, and Romania and some other places, they keep talking about the same kind of thing. What is Russia going to think about all this? Are they going to back down?
No.
It doesn't appear that they are.
Not even
but
a little bit.
it's funny. I mean, you laugh at the mere statement of the question out loud, and yet there are those in Europe that aren't laughing, and they're saying, yeah, I think you will. I guess. I mean, either that or they're just oblivious to the actual danger of nuclear war, which just puzzles me.
It sure does, Danny. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. It's preposterous that they're taking this stance, and even though with all this bravado that the EU's how they come across, they know that they could not possibly do this without American support. Yet they continue on. The day will come where, okay, there is no support. Now what? Then what?
Yeah, you may find out, and it's going to make people's heads explode, like Fiona Hill, like this French senator that we showed, and a whole bunch of other folks in the United States that are just beside themselves of saying bad things about what Trump's trying to do. And I guess we'll see what happens at that point. But it's really discouraging, I got to say, in this extreme.
It really is. But listen,
Gary,
I so appreciate. Oh, just real quick. Listen. I appreciate the presentation you just put together, man. That was, like I said, masterclass. It really helps me understand all that's going on. Yeah, Dan, we've got a great show coming up at 2:00. This is a gentleman I came across on X, and really out of nowhere. I was, doing research, and let me just play you. This guy's name is Johnny Miller.
As political repression descends upon Europe, both on the right and the left, one of the most dangerous phrases to say now is peace in Europe. If you're a journalist, politician, or academic, and you argue for good relations between Europe and Russia, they will go for you. Such is the mass hysteria that has descended. Do what I'm doing now, standing in front of the Kremlin, making such a case, and it's akin to heresy. But since we can't use Ukrainian lives to overthrow the Russian government, since the war is failing, we should be pursuing good relations with Russia in order to trade, in order to fuel our economies. It's not a very radical idea, but our leaders are still stuck in the orthodoxies of the old world, and a new world has arrived. We shouldn't be sending tanks and troops to Ukraine. We should be sending diplomats and business leaders to Moscow.
Danny, this is a guy that's covered the war since the beginning. He's in Russia now. He's been in Ukraine. He's been in the war zone. He knows of what he speaks. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what he's been doing and what he's and you can hear what his take on it.
Well, at least there's somebody in Europe that's on the right side of this. So that's going to be encouraging on its own measure.
It really is. So at 2:00 today, we're having Johnny on. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, and that's one that Gary's going to be running solo. I have indisposed this afternoon and will not be able to do that. And just kind of as we close out here, just a reminder that on Monday, we're going to have a big announcement about some changes at the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. So be tuning in. Probably somewhere around 10 a.m., I'm guessing. 10 a.m. on Monday, an announcement from the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Until then, this is Gary and I signing off, and we'll see you back at 2:00 today.
Unintimidated, uncompromised.